everyone can come in. This is well, it feels like spring, doesn't it? Which is good. So please can this last? And to welcome spring, we have Susannah, our very own Susannah Crockford, who is a lecturer. So I'm also in anthropology. So it's lovely to introduce my colleague, my anthropological colleague, Susannah Crockford, who is a lecturer here in SPFPA in anthropology. So Susannah has published numerous articles and a monograph on spirituality and climate change, based on her extensive ethnographic research in the American South. Her book is entitled Ripples of the Universe, Spirituality in Sedona, Arizona, and it's published by the University of Chicago Press. So before coming to Exeter, Susannah held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Ghent and received her PhD from the LSE in anthropology in 2017. Susannah is currently working on a second book, which is on, well, actually it's an ethnography of climate change. She's developing a project on the ethics and politics of conspiracy theories alongside writing this book. In short, in her work, Susannah brings together her interests in, you know, I can't read my writing, brings together her interest in environmental anthropology with its focus on climate change, her interest in medical anthropology with her focus on opposition to vaccines and alternative health. She also, actually central to her work is religious studies. Susannah is bringing these kind of understandings and public engagements with science with her deep and long-standing interest in religious studies. And we can see this particularly in her work on New Age spirituality and conspiracy theories. Susannah doesn't just do the sort of usual ethnography of going out there chatting to people. She also does digital online ethnography, which you can see if you're interested in conspiracy theories, spirituality, extremism, online extremism. Then you can see that doing a digital ethnography with the more traditional ethnographic projects is the way forward. So her field sites then have included Arizona, Missouri, and Louisiana in the American South, but also in Europe, Belgium, Sweden, and the UK. So over to you, Susannah. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. You always manage to make me sound much cooler than I am, which is amazing. So I thank you for that. So this is for my second research project, which is based on an amalgamation of collected interview, ethnographic, and digital media data that I gathered from 2018 to 2020. I then did nothing for 2 years. I'm sure you can all guess why. And now I'm trying to write it as a book. And what I'm going to read to you today is an excerpt from the second chapter. So normally I tend to just talk in talks because I think that's a bit more natural. But today I am going to read, so you'll just have to bear with me. Okay. Oh, and I should say that the material that this talk is based on is from interviews with 17 climate scientists who are from different career stages and in different subdisciplines, but they all worked in universities in Southeast England, and they all worked in climate and environmental sciences. Okay. In a stuffy basement office in a university in Southeast England, fractures of light blinked through piles of old weather maps and journals lining the walls. Bundles of historical temperature readings going back 100 to 200 years were encrusted with dust that billowed as I walked past. I went down the stairs and through the library to reach the office, escorted by my host, a white British man in his mid-60s. A well-respected climate scientist, now veering into semi-retirement, he talked immediately about climate skeptics. Showing me an article in what he called a good journal that he had himself been published in previously, he told me it was in fact a climate skeptical article. They had suggested their own reviewers, allowing them to pre-select reviewers who would agree with them to fool the editors in his opinion. He talked about the problems of peer review and how they used to have reviewers selected by the editors, but now it was so specialized. The editors get so many papers submitted to them, and that even with a refusal rate of 40%, they just don't have the time or the information to select appropriate reviewers for every paper that is sent to them. We talked a bit more about the limits of peer review and how often, even with blind peer review, you can tell in small disciplines who the reviewers are. So this was an inside conversation about knowledge production. It's the type of conversation that two people who work within the same process system can have, critiquing the problems of peer review while maintaining a sense of good faith in the system itself. Neither of us was suggesting that peer review itself was a flawed system, but that within the system, the assumption of good faith could allow motivated individuals to take advantage to advance their own interests. It was a problem of scale. With so many more submissions, there were not enough peer reviewers, and with hyper-specialization in scientific disciplines, editors were no longer positioned to find the most appropriate reviewer. Lacking grounding in the specificities of the research used in a paper, reviewers could also give inappropriate field feedback. Another climate scientist who specialized in paleoceanography commented to me during their interview that sometimes peer reviewers did not understand methodology specific to certain subdisciplines. A reviewer had recently criticized her methodology in a submission, and she found herself communicating back the standard protocols in this subdiscipline. She had to work to get them to a place where they can understand why what I did was useful. It's worth reflecting on that phrase for a moment because it reveals something important about how scientific knowledge is produced. Conclusions are not self-evidently apparent, even with the methodology and data open and explicit. For those without the training in a specific subdiscipline, they had to be moved, trained, even educated to get to a place where they could appreciate the utility of the results. The paleoceanographer then reflected on this statement and concluded that if she was talking to someone who was a climate skeptic, there would be no point in doing this. If they had already decided they were skeptical of climate science, there was no point explaining the science to them. It was more ideological, she concluded. So in some ways, this conclusion seems to defeat the purpose of scientific communication. If science cannot be communicated to those who disagree, or even just those who do not share a specific subdisciplinary training, what is the purpose of communicating about science at all? Why shouldn't scientists shut themselves off in their dusty basement offices or high-tech labs and speak only to others who are already in a space where they could understand what each other did was useful? But I don't think that that's what she was actually saying. She was someone who was genuinely committed to scientific communication. She took time to talk to me, an anthropologist, which many of the climate scientists I contacted who did not think it was worth their time. So I think that what she was trying to express was that if she was talking to someone who was a climate skeptic, then that specific person, there would be no point doing it, right? That if they, if they were only going to listen to the point where they would agree with her, then those who were not willing to do so, she was acknowledging that some people were just never going to agree with her. So in that case, there was no point talking to them. And the word she used for this was ideology, a system of ideas that she imagined was different to science, in which claims could be upheld on bases other than facts. So I'm going to read her dismissal of climate skepticism as ideological through the conceptualization of ideology in Marxist philosophy, particularly that of Louis Althusser. Ideology is those ideas, material practices, and state institutions that uphold, maintain, and perpetuate the economic interests of the ruling class. Ideology has material existence for Althusser. It is what keeps people blind to their exploitative conditions, the famous false consciousness of Marx and Engels. What my interlocutors said about climate skepticism fits with this theory because it's false ideas, i.e. that anthropogenic climate change is a hoax or not as serious as claimed or are not caused by humans, blinds people from accepting the reality of their material conditions, that climate change is caused by humans and is increasingly harming human welfare on a planetary basis. While I do not wish to argue that my interlocutor was a crypto-Marxist, what I seek to highlight is the radical system-challenging implications of the facts that climate scientists have produced in recent decades. But first, back to this notion of facts. As is already implicit in the opening vignettes, the facts reported in scientific articles are not self-evident. Even to other climate scientists sometimes, those outside of subdisciplinary regimes may need to be coached into understanding the usefulness of a particular protocol. What is authorized by publication can be constructed in other ways too, even going so far as selecting reviewers to rubber stamp the report's conclusions, which can result in good journals publishing climate skeptic articles. Those articles can then be cited and discussed on blogs and on social media. They can reach Parliament and policymakers, and they can then support those engaged in questioning the veracity of climate science to advance their claims that the science is not settled. So climate skepticism, as this view, is not produced in opposition, but from a position entirely outside the system, but through the methodologies of climate science and in interaction with and within the same discursive system. And yet, the persuasive power of the fact remains. The basic claim that separate independent groups of researchers can use similar methods and find similar outcomes produces this power. This was the position that Professor Phil Jones of the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia took. That's Phil Jones there. When he was assailed by attacks from climate skeptics following the publication of his hacked emails in 2009. He said, "Our global temperature series tallies with those of other completely independent groups of scientists working for NASA and the National Climate Data Center in the United States, among others. Even if you were to ignore our findings, theirs show the same results. The facts speak for themselves. There is no need for anyone to manipulate them." Jones was speaking up to defend his work against the attacks that he had manipulated the data that showed increasing average global temperatures. One of the emails published had talked about using a trick to depict the data in a specific way. This word was seized upon by climate skeptic blogs who called Jones a fraud. This incident became known as Climategate. The emails were construed as evidence that climate scientists were hiding signs of countervailing temperature trends such as the medieval warm period. Even more seriously, they were accused of engaging in a conspiracy to undermine capitalism through engineering the hoax of global warming. These allegations show that the social and political implications of climate change are seen, at least by climate skeptics, as challenging the current economic system of global capitalism. Controversy was taken seriously by the highest levels of the UK government, and there were 3 separate reviews with questioning by MPs, which ultimately exonerated the CRU and Jones. So as part of Jones's witness testimony to Parliament in 2010, he was asked why raw data could not be independently verified, to which Jones replied and explained that the standard protocol in his field was that they published the paper, but they did not make the data available. Graham Stringer, a Labour MP and later Brexiteer, and also a climate skeptic, accused Jones of not making data available to be verified by independent scientists on purpose, and claimed that one has to take everything you do on trust. Jones pointed to the agreement with other datasets. His data accorded with comparable datasets and therefore could be taken as confirmed. The difference between raw data and what Jones called the derived product was an issue. Scientists wanted the latter, so that's what they made available. He noted that the raw data was available in the US, and it was not standard practice in the field to release everything, including programs, weather station locations, data sets, and codes. Here, Jones was trying to communicate the standard protocol in his field to one who seemed unfamiliar with it. He was trying to make him realize the usefulness of the data, yet Stringer demurred. If it is not standard practice, how can science progress? Jones mentioned peer reviewers generally did not ask for raw data, but it would be available if they did. So this is an outsider conversation about knowledge production. The politician Stringer was asking questions without understanding, or perhaps without showing his understanding of the standard protocols in the field. His position was also that science progressed through independent teams using the same methods to find the same results. But he thought this was not possible unless the exact same raw data could be verified. Since that raw data was not made available, due to privacy concerns of some of the governments that provided the temperature readings, the facts could not speak for themselves. Instead, Stringer positioned Jones as the only one speaking, and reframed the issue to focus on trust in him as an individual. The objectivity of facts was displaced by personal subjectivity. Despite being a more common position in social studies of science, I found that among the climate scientists I spoke to, that the acceptance of subjectivity remained problematic. Younger climate scientists in particular tended to describe themselves as neutral and objective, as providers of information, conveyors of facts. A postdoctoral researcher who worked on ocean microbiology described the role of scientists to me as, we really need to provide relevant, correct information. Similarly, a postdoctoral climate modeler was firm that science is a tool for providing information and that it becomes dangerous if scientists start to do politics. He equally thought it was suspect when politicians tried to do science. Interestingly, these two researchers were both at a relatively early stage of their career. I had similar sentiments from scientists in secure positions, although those later in their careers had more confidence to admit fallibility and faults, that no one is perfect. They tended to maintain that the scientist as the neutral, objective observer is the ideal to aspire to, even if imperfect. There were also differences in the level of activity thought necessary to convey the information they gathered. The older generation thought publishing papers was enough, whereas the younger scientists saw public engagement as crucial to connect with wider audiences through public scholarship or social media. But the role remained the same. Provide the facts, other people act on the facts. What they focused on, therefore, was the accuracy of the facts they provided. Yet Climategate seems to indicate that something else is going on. Professor Jones's data was accurate, and he could point to equivalent data sets to establish that. Yet the controversy roiled and continues to do so, at least on some parts of the internet. Coupled with the illegal activity in obtaining the emails released, which had a level of complexity that infers the involvement of a hostile state actor, it seems straightforward to conclude that Climategate was a bad faith attack. More accurate facts or more open science would not have stopped it. Those determined to attack would just find a different entry point to do so. Which brings me to an animating question of this book: why attack climate science? If society is run according to a form of rationality that elevates knowledge and facts and follows them in a logical way, why would anyone want to attack climate science? Why not keep the attacks and disagreements about how to address climate change within the realm of politics? I argue that climate science has become a form of contested knowledge. Forms of knowledge are mediated by social power. Facts do not speak for themselves, but speak through human interlocutors who are implicated in relations of social, political, and economic power. In making this argument, I leveraged the work in Anthropology of Science by Bruno Latour that queries the objective a priori existence of scientific facts. Anthropology of Science provides a theoretical frame for a consideration of climate science as a form of knowledge production, following anthropologist Hannah Knox's approach in her 2020 book, Thinking Like a Climate, and drawing further inspiration from her observation that climate change can be transgressive of politics. It is this transgressiveness of the concept of climate change, authorized and legitimated by climate scientists, that I focus on here. Climate science as a form of knowledge has become contested on the basis of its implications to existing power structures. Climate change implicates the carbon-based economy as an existential threat, yet this economy supports existing power relations. Global capitalism is soaked in oil, coal, and gas. Decarbonization, ceasing to use these fossilized forms of energy, is the obvious solution to climate change, yet it is not happening. Each year, despite all of the models simulating increasing Arctic sea ice loss, methane released from the permafrost, and CO2 correlated with increasing global average temperature, despite all of the observations that build these models and the accuracy of the facts provided by climate scientists, the emissions continue to rise. And this graph, shows the emissions from 1960s to 2020 with the dates of the large climate agreements made internationally. And as you can see, despite these international agreements saying they're going to do something, it just keeps rising and rising and rising. So climate science, therefore, has become knowledge that power refuses to be true. Climate science as contested knowledge challenges the straightforward flow of information from scientists to their publics and raises further questions. What conditions make knowledge possible? What if scientists discover something that no one wants to know? And it's here that I think the points raised by my scientist interlocutors could profitably speak with Marxist philosophy. After she said that ideology prevented climate skeptics from understanding the relevance of her results, the paleoceanographer apologized for what she called a side tangent. But often such tangents are the most revealing, especially in the artificial container of an interview. What she was saying is that some people are not going to understand, no matter how well it is explained to them or how sound the data is, because they have already made up their minds to refuse to accept it. This individualizes the problem, yet the word she used was ideological. Althusser systematized the conception of ideology beyond the rough outlines provided by Marx and Engels. Ideology was how the ruling classes reproduced their dominance so that they maintained their control over the means of production. But it worked, Althusser elaborated, through the state. And in the state and its apparatuses, he included private organizations that maintained the authority of the state. Ideological state apparatuses function to maintain the authority and legitimacy of the state without recourse to violence. And among those apparatuses, scientific institutions can be included. Althusser argued that technoscience replaced former forms of knowledge with those validated by scientific authority that derived from its method. Prior forms were dismissed as ideological. In this side tangent, the paleoceanographer followed this movement of constructing scientific authority on its method, the production of facts through empirically verifiable and replicable methods, and consigned those who did not follow this method to the bin of ideology. But in doing so, she occluded the ideological role of science in upholding and maintaining power relations. Where the results of those methods challenge power, science can no longer hold its prior status because its social and political role was never purely to produce facts. It was to maintain the legitimacy and authority of the ruling class. When it ceases to do that, it becomes a form of contested knowledge. Let me expand. In establishing the anthropogenic causes of climate change, climate science has provided a concept that is a quantifiable, measurable way to talk about the problems of modernity. Climate change is a scientifically validated problem, and as such, it carries weight and social power. It can become the basis of claims for political change and transformation. And we've seen this in recent activist movements like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil that carry placards by saying things like, follow the science. What you should do is just follow what the science is saying to you. Science can be leveraged to demand action in a way that other forms of knowledge cannot. By constructing computational models that simulate potential climate futures, climate science has what Mike Hume argues is an inordinate level of power over social and political imaginaries, and in the process opens up a form of reductionism. And while Hume warns against the dangers of, in his words, reducing the future to climate, that such power is possible is, in my reading, as a potential challenge against state power. Climate models are not merely, or not only, numerical abstractions rendered into computer simulations that project likely outcomes, dependent on a range of variables. They are read as visions of the future, even as prophecies. When the headline screamed in 2018 that we only had 12 years left to save the planet, you can see that on a Greenpeace banner there. What is happening is they're converting the IPCC assessment that 12 years is the likely range in which we can limit warming below 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. Through this conversion of the carefully measured projections that a consensus of leading climate scientists agree upon, climate science becomes a social force, a demand for change, and a disruption of existing power relations. Scientific knowledge has been rendered both illegible and alarmist, according to human geographer Iris Braverman, so has not led to political action. In part, this is a continuation of the media science interaction in which the carefully measured statements of scientists are transformed through the discursive limits of reporting to become both sensationalized, the world's going to end in 12 years, and yet at the same time hiding the true extent. But it is not simply a matter of how climate science is reported in the media. It is the facts themselves. Climate science is producing knowledge that is incommensurable with the political economic formations that allow it to speak. As such, we see two significant responses to climate science from nation states and their apparatuses, one more prevalent than the other. The less prevalent is the bad faith attacks, such as Climategate, and the funding of what sociologists McCreight and Dunlap call organized denial. fossil fuel companies paying scientists to produce contradictory reports and data that can be used in legal and political arenas to muddy the waters. The more prevalent response is the persistent disregard shown to the implications of climate science, in which politicians agree with one side of their mouths to aggressive, transformative climate action, and with the other side agree to new roads, new airport runways, new oil and gas leases, leading to more emissions, continuing the expansion of the common economy that maintains their hegemony, and the network of corporations that power and profit from global capitalism. Another side tangent towards the end of our interview, from a London-based climate scientist specializing in paleoclimate research. It's not about facts, he said. I had mentioned anti-vaccination movements, and he told me about a relative of his who rejected vaccines. He and his wife had tried to argue with her using facts and evidence, and she had rejected it, asking why they were discounting her personal experience. People feel like they are being talked down to by scientists, he reflected, but he hoped that was not what he was like. At least that was not his intention. But to him, personal experience is meaningless. Personal opinion is not evidence. The individual lifespan is so short, and our individual perception so hopelessly biased that it cannot provide accurate information about the nature of the world. Memory could also not be relied upon. It forms a reconstruction, not a recording of the past. Although in accepting this, he found that his wife used it against him in domestic arguments where they were critically different. In science, he saw the aim as reducing the human component, accepting that anecdote and experience are not data, and recording things objectively. But he also said the social sciences were needed, especially on the issue of climate communication, because he did not know how to change people's minds on it. He seemed like he had given up hope that he could. On the one hand, he saw the role of science to record and report objective data to provide the facts, but on the other, he saw in his own personal life how he could not convince even those close to him with facts. So, climate scientists provide the facts, the graphs, the models, the data. They interface with state agencies. They produce reports and policy briefs. But effective climate action remains a struggle, which Hannah Knox identifies as a bigger barrier than denial or skepticism. In her fieldwork in Manchester, her interlocutors were generally in agreement of the facts about climate change, yet they still struggle to scale up from this agreement to action. Using Isabel Stenger's term ontological politics, Knox analyzes how her interlocutors struggle over the effects of climate-disrupting infrastructures like new roads and air traffic, and their own ways of being in a world associated with modernity. They find that although they accept the facts, they cannot simply stop the emissions, even on a personal level. So why don't facts instrumentalize action? I suggest the problem comes with this deceptively innocuous term, fact. What if climate change is not only a scientific fact, but also a social fact? And here I go back to the work of Emil Durkheim, who theorized a social fact as an externally coercive force, things we are not literally forced to do, but find we cannot do otherwise. While we are not literally forced to use fossil fuels, we find just by living in our current society with the infrastructure of modernity, we can do no other. Durkheim's emphasis was that society is more than the sum of individual actions, that it exists above and beyond any particular individual at the level of the collective. The current paralysis on climate change, as described by my interlocutors and in Knox's work, has been partly fueled by relying on the actions of individuals, whether the vaguely defined everyone who has to do their part by reducing their personal consumption emissions by going vegan or foregoing air travel, or the more specifically, but still vague, elites who are in control of the companies that significantly contribute to the rising levels of carbon emissions through production. This leads to a circuitous argument, where producers blame consumers and consumers blame producers. If we think with Durkheim, there are some things that exist beyond and above us as individuals, but that determine our norms, institutions, and values. As previously mentioned, Hume makes us aware how determinism is especially problematic when thinking about climate change. Climate is neither the only factor of relevance, nor is it entirely epiphenomenal to culture and sociality. The same is true for how knowledge of the climate is produced. Appreciating the sociality of knowledge production is not the same as saying that all truths are equal. Nuancing claims to understand what is hidden or neglected by positions of objectivity can also be repurposed to manipulate in the interests of the powerful. In an American Anthropologist Forum piece from 2019, Karen Ho and Gillian Kavanagh revivified Durkheim's notion of the social fact. Moving it beyond the functionalism of providing solidarity in societies, they argue that social facts can also be irrational, illogical, or dysfunctional, as well as creating cohesion and coercion. Climate change is perhaps an ideal illustration of a dysfunctional social fact, a thing that undeniably exists that actively undermines social cohesion and continuity. Whether functional or not, social facts are produced by and in return produce the collective. The collectivity sees itself through social facts and through the way things are supposed to be, as a way of apprehending the social order of things. Fossil fuels are part of the social order, and beyond that, people in the global north see themselves as part of modernity, as possessing a modern subjectivity. So it is worth bringing these reflections about modernity together with the question of what a fact is. Literary critic and historian Mary Poovey argues that there is something distinctive about what she heuristically calls the modern fact, in that it's both discrete and systematic. Modern facts stand or speak for themselves, and yet they can also link together to tell a broader narrative, epitomized by the number of theme non-interpretive, separate from theory and interpretation, things sui generis. But they are not, as they are based on a series of assumptions about what should or should not be counted or measured, which then become the basis for the systematic knowledge. If the measurements are limited, so will the system they go on to constitute. Temperature measurements are modern facts. The numbers stand by themselves as discrete entities, a thing which tells us the temperature in a specific space and time. These readings are then collated with a number of other readings to provide a trend. The increasing trend of temperature readings globally is one of the principal signals of climate change. Here, the discrete unit can then be read as a narrative. The singular readings on their own become meaningful and give rise to an explanation that increasing temperatures are caused by increasing CO2 levels. Temperature measurements are discrete observations, i.e. facts, and also the basis for a systematic knowledge of the climate. Poovey calls modern facts a historical phase of epistemology associated with modernity. This phase has been followed, she argues, by a postmodern overturning of the modern fact based on observed particulars with rule-governed autonomous models. Data is then made into models to give a range of the normal, which is one step removed from the initial observation, an abstraction that now counts as knowledge. This can be seen in the predominance of climate models, which are abstractions of data about atmospheric and environmental conditions in the biosphere, aggregated and then simulated to provide a narrative of what may happen in the future. But the narratives remain dependent on the data, how it was produced, how it was decided, what should be counted. That is why some climate scientists, such as Kevin Anderson from Uppsala University and the University of Manchester, express skepticism over some models, such as those constructed to show that net zero should be reached by 2050 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. According to Anderson, these models undercount emissions responsibility, as they are formulated by modelers from wealthy, high-carbon nations in a way that displaces those nations' consumption emissions onto the global south nations that produce the goods that they consume. The IPCC's models therefore reproduce colonial relations in Anderson's critique, avoiding what he sees as the equity and reality-based conclusions that global north countries should reach net zero between 2030 and 2035 through massive and rapid reductions in materials and energy use. Climate models are built on data or facts that are produced through social relations of global capitalism that perpetuate the historical injustices of colonialism and extraction. We might call these relations collective representations, that even if the specific group of modelers that Anderson identifies do not mean to do so, these representations still exert influence over their construction of fact. In this case, collective representations mediate who is responsible for emissions and how, therefore, how therefore they should be counted and mitigated. The way modern facts are constructed can be used to support the way modernity itself has been constructed. For those of us familiar with the work of Bruno Latour, the argument that facts must be constructed, built up through authority and rendered legible is no surprise. Anthropologist Joseph DeMitt expands on this idea to discuss how to successfully state facts. In the case of pharmaceuticals that he studies, he found that corporations often act as mediators between experts and lay publics. Pharmaceutical companies mediate between doctors and patients, often proactively recommending one treatment over another in a way that privileges their profit margins in absence of any clear difference in treatment outcomes. As DeMitt reflects, facts require contextualization. As with pharmaceuticals, the corporations that mediate between lay publics and experts on climate change are morally compromised by their position as profit-making entities. Fossil fuel companies have proved themselves reluctant, to put it generously, to adequately inform lay publics of the significance of the climate impact of their product. They have instead spent decades funding and spreading disconfirmatory research that undermines the link between fossil fuels and climate change, as shown in the work of Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. As part of my research, I've also spoken to people who have spent their careers working in the oil and gas industries. And when I asked about fossil fuel companies funding disinformation, I was told, you call this disinformation. But I would say, why would you affect our business? Why indeed? The authority required to render facts legible is held not only by climate scientists, but also by fossil fuel companies who fund and employ their own scientists, and further by political figures who are often similarly in receipt of large donations from the same fossil fuel companies. Graham Stringer, the Labour MP who questioned Professor Jones in the Climategate inquiry and sat on the Common Science and Technology Committee, which is meant to ensure government decisions are based on sound scientific evidence, is also a trustee of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. This is a registered charity set up immediately after the Climategate hacks by Nigel Lawson. You may remember him as Thatcher's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is now a Tory peer. And the organisation disseminates climate skeptic policy briefs and published material. And it has also received significant funding from organisations that act as middlemen for fossil fuel conglomerates Exxon and Koch Industries, at least according to The Guardian. They deny it. Here we see the entanglements of fossil fuel corporations, state representatives, and scientific knowledge production that influence how facts are socially contextualized and mediated. It is this entanglement that renders climate science as contested knowledge because, to paraphrase my fossil fuel industry interlocutors, why would you expect them to work against their own business model? Why would you expect modernity to undo itself? I've mentioned modernity throughout this talk, so it's worth now turning briefly to the scholar who has done the most to unpick modernity's self-fascination, Bruno Latour. In Facing Gaia, Latour argues that the separation characteristic of modernity between nature and culture is no longer tenable given the culturally wrought natural system disruptions we call climate change. Yet it was a separation born of a need by moderns to separate knowledge and illusion, even though practically this distinction does not exist. It is only a theoretical distinction, as facts are simultaneously real and constructed. In On the Modern Cult of Factish Gods, Latour suggests that moderns worship facts as fetishes. Human actors are determined by invisible forces such as gods and divinities, what Latour calls fairy objects, and also by forces such as biology, genetics, society, economics, which he calls fact objects. Those beyond modernity allow this dualism to coexist comfortably. And whereas moderns deny the power of fairy objects, but reinforce the power of fact objects, the result is what he calls factish, or the robust certainty that allows practice to pass into action without the practitioner ever believing in the difference between construction and reality, immanence and transcendence. Factishes make construction the same as truth, as they pass continually from construction to autonomy without ever believing in either. Is climate change, the association between rising temperatures and increases in greenhouse gases, what Latour would call a factish? To build on what I said earlier about climate change as a social fact, Latour critiques the social in Durkheim's work as opaque, even transcendent. Moderns invented representation to link concepts of subjects with interiority and objects with exteriority, devaluing the former in favor of the latter. Whereas there is no essential difference between facts and fetishes, according to Latour. Neither is entirely external and objective or internal and subjective. Latour names as dull realism the statement, "The facts speak for themselves in the eyes of impartial colleagues." This gently mocking statement in his 2010 work is almost a paraphrase of Professor Jones's statements to defend his work in the Climategate controversy. For Latour, this dull realism smooths over the rocky processes of fabricating facts through observation and measurement through to simulation and abstraction, from tables of temperature measurements aggregated and compiled and then visualized into the reddening globes shown in climate models, like these, which are the IPCC's various pathways. This is like a best case scenario, and this is a worst case scenario. Skeptics pick away at these fabrications. We must see the tables of raw data. We must double check where your weather stations are precisely positioned to construct and fabricate their own facts, which are then given power through the false equivalence of artificial debate, bolstered by the political and economic power of various state apparatuses. They try to unpack what Latour called in his earlier work black boxes, scientific processes that have already been formulated and constructed and are too complex to know more than the input and output, such as using the standard protocol of releasing only the derived product, not the raw data, being a routine choice for Jones. Climategate played out in politically motivated blogs and parliamentary inquiries rather than scientific journals and conferences, but it shows how science is enmeshed in political economic forces, even if individual climate scientists wish it were not so. The scale of the crisis of which climate change is a part is so vast, so excessive of current political managerial practices, so conflicted by entangled interests, that it calls for far more than facts. In a piece he wrote responding to Climategate, Latour declared that the climate crisis asks for nothing less than a radical revolution. Not the class-based revolution that Marxists like Althusser called for, but a revolution that reorders all levels of global capitalism and undoes modernity itself. As acknowledged in the interview with the London-based climate scientist, he said, "We could fix climate change, just like we could fix poverty in the UK, but we don't because people don't want to." He said, "There's too many vested interests. We let millions of people die now from poverty, so it is quite likely that we will let millions of people die from climate change." He said he did not think the whole world was going to end, but it was going to get worse. And it was not going to get worse equally. It wouldn't be that much worse in Hertford where he lived, but it would be much worse in the locations that were already vulnerable to socioeconomic inequalities. When he started out in his scientific career, he went to his first big international conference on climate change and heard the American climate scientist James Hansen speak, and he thought it would be easy. He would help by teaching people science, they would receive the right information, that would change people's minds about the importance and significance of climate change. But it didn't happen that way. He became much more pessimistic and also much more left-wing since working in a university. The current system did not allow for fixing these big problems if it meant certain vested interests would lose out. So it was not just about giving people accurate information. It was about so much more than that, he concluded. It was about how people behave in groups. So this is perhaps the beginning of a climate scientist beginning to perceive what we could call the social. And that perhaps we could suggest that causes of climate change emerge from this strange transcendentality that Durkheim called the social, making climate change this externally coercive force of our collective representations, this thinking that we are modern, that we are separate from and in mastery of nature. And now we are looking that representation in the face as it bears back down upon us. Thank you.